Hi, as Scott said, this is On My Nightstand, and I am Laura Cathcart-Robbins. And today we are bringing you excerpts from the book by last week's guest, Jessica Nordell. I hope you enjoyed her interview as much as we did. And she talked about her book, The End of Bias, which is what I'm going to be reading from. I'm actually reading the book. This is not from my laptop, so you will probably, if you listen closely, hear me turning some pages throughout. But first, a little bit about Jessica. Jessica Nordell is a science and culture journalist whose writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Republic, and many other publications. A former writer for public radio and producer for American Public Media, she graduated from Harvard University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The End of Bias, A Beginning is her first book. Like I said, I'm reading to you certain excerpts, and I'm going to start with one from the section titled How Bias Works. So she's talking about a woman that I believe is a social scientist or maybe a scientist. And she's working on an experiment, and it's not making sense to her. And the person's name is Divine. So Divine had set out to test the sincerity of white people who said they oppose racism. At this moment in the mid-1980s, psychologists were flummoxed by a phenomenon we might call prejudice paradox. On one hand, white Americans overwhelmingly opposed racial prejudice. When asked, they denied holding racist beliefs. On the other hand, many still acted in racially discriminatory ways, both in lab settings and in the real world. Prominent psychologists of the era, faced with this contradiction, concluded that these people were hiding their true beliefs in order to protect their image. White people who said they weren't racist were lying. Divine wasn't so sure. This verdict didn't ring true to her. It didn't match her experience of people and her knowledge of the world. What about white people who've actively fought against racism? Were they faking it too? She was white. She knew she sincerely opposed racism. The notion that all these white people were engaging in a mass game of make-believe was hard to accept. There must be something else happening in their minds. And now this is an experience that Jessica herself had. And in this section, she's talking about prejudice against Muslim people. And she's talking about different representations of it in the media. So she says, these representations cement our associations. A fact made vivid to me one snowy day several winters ago. I had bundled up books and writing materials and hiked over to the university library near my house. I was hoping for sweet silence, and I was in luck. It was finals week, so while the giant reading room I entered was packed with students, it was hushed except for the tapping of keyboards. I slid into one of the few empty chairs and got to work. About an hour later, I heard a rustling and looked up to see a young man walking down the aisle toward a crowded end of the room. Another man followed him. They unrolled small prayer rugs and knelt down. As I watched, I felt the palms of my hands grow sweaty. My heart rate quickened. My breath became shallow. To my own bewilderment, I displayed all the signs of a fear response because I was watching two Muslim men pray. Up until that moment, I hadn't realized that there was a link in my mind between Islam and fear. The truth is that I'm more likely to be killed by an armed toddler than a Muslim terrorist. But in the years leading up to that winter day, I, like every other news watcher and reader in our society, had seen Muslims linked to terrorism. And then she goes on to talk about women, which I think is really interesting. She says women as a group are still represented in media differently than men. In 2019, women made up only 37% of major characters in Hollywood's biggest films. In 1942, they made up 33%. An analysis of 2,000 Hollywood screenplays found that even in movies with female protagonists, like Disney's princess films, men speak more dialogue than women. When women are depicted, they are often shown as supporters rather than protagonists. Likewise, in video games, female characters often aid others, often as assistants to the male lead. In this post-Weinstein era, it has become increasingly clear that the images of women issuing from Hollywood for the last several decades were, in large part, even quite literally, controlled by someone who viewed them as disposable non-humans. The effect of sensibility on contemporary notions of womanhood is incalculable. These associations between women and support are now also embedded in the digital infrastructure of our lives. The voice-activated AIs we increasingly rely on to play music or send messages for us are by default presented as human. They're Siri, Norse for beautiful woman who leads you to victory, Amazon's Alexa, and Microsoft's Cortana, named after a voluptuous video game character who wears a holographic body stocking. We ask Siri, Alexa, and Cortana for help, and they offer it cheerfully, seamlessly. Some analytics attribute these decisions to research that people prefer women's voices. Nevertheless, every time a female AI attends to the administrative tasks of our complex lives, associations between womanhood and servility are reinforced. This is very interesting to me. This is what she wrote. This is in 2003 and 2004, civil rights attorney Connie Rice spent 18 months interviewing LAPD officers. And then she's talking about some of the findings. But the officers told Rice something that surprised her. They confided that they were afraid of black men. "Look, lady, I'm going to be honest with you. Black people scare me. I didn't grow up around black people," she remembers them saying. "I grew up in Antelope Valley. We don't have any blacks. And I don't really know how to talk to them. Or, lady, black men scare me, and I need help." Rice tried to keep her reactions to herself. She didn't want to lose their trust by showing her shock. Inwardly, she said, "I was stunned. Fear is not something police officers typically admit to. Vulnerability is seen as a liability." But officers of all races were confessing to a racialized fear. Fear, of course, does not account for cases of intentional brutality. But the anxiety these cops professed is consistent with research showing that the mere notion of blackness conjures up the idea of crime in many people's minds. Psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt, who has spent decades studying how race influences perceptions and behavior, conducted a study in which she subliminally exposed people to black and white men's faces. Then she showed them grainy, hard-to-make-out images of knives and guns. Those exposed to black men's faces picked out the weapons more readily than those exposed to white men's faces. They didn't just think of crime, they saw crime. Eberhardt also showed police officers a series of black and white faces they were told might be faces of criminals and asked them whether each face looked criminal. Having a black face is not a crime, as Eberhardt points out. Yet her study found that the more stereotypically black the face was, rated in terms of facial features and skin tone, the more likely officers were to identify it as criminal. And then I'm just going to end with this because I asked her at the end of our interview how we can build the collective will to end bias, because her book is called The End of Bias, and this is what she sent me. "Motivation and awareness go hand in hand. To create the will to change, we have to communicate the catastrophic consequence of bias. The harms, both individual and collective, from loss of careers, health, and life, to the loss of progress as a society. But we also have to communicate what we gain collectively when we create a world beyond it: trust, creativity, innovation, justice. To create that, we can also build meaningful relationships across differences so everyone has a truly personal stake in the matter, because every act of bias affects someone they love. To create that will, we can deepen our knowledge of history, because the more we understand the past, the more clearly we can see the present, and the more eager we become to repair it."